Hi, and welcome to It's Not History, episode 21. Still here. This is Michael Mantooth.
So my Native American heritage comes from my mother's side, and my maternal grandfather is White Top from the Sizemore and Goins families in the White Top tribal community, which is kind of on the border of West Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky and that little area there. And I didn't start kind of getting, I didn't feel the need to look any further back than that because, I already knew who my people were. And then when I got into college, I became very interested because, I became aware that, like, oh, there's actually a ton of different types of tribes. And so I became curious about, where did the rest of my ancestors come from? Nobody's entirely sure where they came from. So I started to become very interested in history and genealogy. And as I did that, I found in a marriage record for one of my Native American ancestors who was descended from the Mantooth family through the Patawomeck tribe. And they had this marriage record between him and a, quote, Susquehanna Indian. And I became very curious about, what does that mean, a Susquehanna Indian? And as I did more research, I was like, oh, like this is a tribe that used to exist that no longer exists. And, I didn't really feel comfortable attaching, the label of Conestoga Susquehannock to myself or anything like that because I didn't realize that there was still a community of people who not only claim that heritage today, but have done that continuously throughout time with these different legal and recognition efforts. So, when I first started getting involved in this topic and learning more about this specific part of my ancestry, I too expected this to circle back to a, they were all killed off and it's very sad kind of thing. And then when I became connected, I realized, like, not only is it not just one family, because in my personal opinion, and I don't say this on behalf of the tribe, this is just my personal opinion, that a single marriage from the 80s or whatever, a single family line does not constitute a tribe. That's not a community. That's not a legal entity. That's not like that's ancestry. That's not culture. That's not heritage. That's not a community that's maintained its language, its culture, its practices, etc. Like there's a huge difference there to me in my mind. So I didn't feel comfortable with that until I realized, like, oh wait, like there's actually a lot of people who can make that claim today, who can legally back up that claim today, who descend, from the seven people who sought land rights in 1845, or the 80 to 100 people who were part of the recognition effort in the 1940s, and that's what really changed my mindset and actually triggered me to become quite involved in the tribe, whereas before I'd been more comfortable with the White Top tribe. And it had made me realize, there's a whole history there that for some reason has never been fully acknowledged or discussed. And so I kind of I get kind of fixated on things, and I went on this, like, 6-month fixation of researching everything I could possibly find about this the moment I realized, like, there are other families, there are other people in census documents, there are other people in legal documents, and that community is very much still there. And that's, I think, what really makes this story interesting is, it's not just people claiming that their great, 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 whatever was Susquehannock or whatever. It's like, this is a continuous community. And that's been very game changing for how I approached things in writing out the history. It's a deeply complicated story, so it's not always, it's not easy to figure out, like, where do you start. I think the easiest place to start is maybe, the absolute beginning, right? We know we came along the Susquehanna River from the Haudenosaunee tribes in the north. We know we were distinct as a culture and as a language sometime, I think around like the 1500s, give or take. It became clear that we were our own distinct people. And then we later kind of, in the late 1550s to 1600s, we know we migrated southward into the Chesapeake Bay because we were looking for better conditions for farming, which is a common issue when we talk about Native American law. and how colonists interacted with natives, because there's a long running tradition in early US history of saying, well, they're not farmers, therefore the land does not belong to them. They're flora and fauna, in early American Indian law, right? When we start having these major case decisions come, the genuine status of native people was considered like, oh, there's trees and there's animals and there's natives, it's all the same. They don't actually own this property. Um, and so as you move forward, we start having these colonial interactions pretty early on. Our first contact, though, we already had trade goods. So we know that there's a lot of trade happening. There's a lot of movement up and down the river, and that's been true throughout our entire history. And in those first contacts, we form this alliance with the state, well, with what will become the state of Maryland. And it's very interesting to look, because essentially the state of Maryland wanted us to serve as a buffer zone and to create a defensive barrier between the emerging state of Maryland and the tribes to the north, the Haudenosaunee tribes, who would periodically raid. And it's interesting how, because I think that really sums up a lot of how the Susquehannock and the Conestoga Susquehannock people have been viewed basically throughout all history from contact to present, which is basically, what utility can we find in these people? And today that's transformed, because there's no utility, right, in recognizing the survival of our tribe. There's no utility in doing that. In fact, there's legal complications in doing that. And I think that particular theme of where where do colonial mindsets find us useful, right? I think that's been a strain that's continued all the way through to present. And I think that's an issue that really gets into a lot of how Native Americans were seen also, where there are things that we're seen as useful for, and there are things that we're not useful for. And I think especially around this period in time, where if you look at writings and newspaper articles, I mean, people were terrified at this point in history, right? And I think the utility of Conestoga Town was largely at that point as a meeting place. There's numerous tribes, numerous entities that came together there, and that was the utility in keeping it there. And at the point when the Indian Wars were, I mean, in 1763, right, we're about to go into a major conflict with Pontiac's War and these different things. And, you have this environment where suddenly it's no longer useful to have basically a Native American highway right outside of your cities. The trails there, the way that the tribes would interact, and we would have visitors coming in from the Haudenosaunee periodically. We know there's a ton of travel back and forth. We see that in letters. We know that Shikellamy was there. We know his sister was considered a Conestoga Indian. There's implications that he himself might have been, but he was also a chief among the Oneida. There's these deeply complicated kinship relationships with tribes that are generally considered to be unfriendly. And so you have a very deeply complicated situation where, as long as Conestoga Town is useful as a way to gain land from these tribes and to establish boundaries that are beneficial for the emerging colony of Pennsylvania, right? As long as that's still true, it's worth maintaining. And when that's not true, right, and you have people come back to try to establish land claims in 1845, because you have to remember the Conestoga Massacre is just 12 or 13 years prior to the American Revolution. So you have this major disruption that happens, and then when people try to come back, right, at a point in time when it's no longer useful to have these treaty operations in place to gain more and more land, because the entirety of Pennsylvania is already in colonial control, then now we have this issue where, oh well, we don't really have a need to bring natives back to Conestoga Town. I think one of the things that's very difficult, I think, about navigating Native American identity, especially in a modern context looking back at historical records. You know, Native American communities are very much a situation where the the people who are making those policies and decisions have already shot the arrow, and they're going to draw the target wherever it landed. We're savages when they need us to be savages. We're peaceful and Christianized when they need us to be peaceful and Christianized. There is always that lingering excuse, right, to justify violence when necessary. And we see that all the way through, even to modern day times, about how certain tribes are denied their rights. You know, we know, for example, that Native American women were forcibly sterilized into the 1970s. And the number one excuse or justification for doing that was, well, they're not really responsible enough to be parents, or we're doing them a favor by doing this. And there's this constant push and pull of overreaching, right? And making these assumptions and having these policies and saying, oh, well, you need us to take care of you, which we know happened at Conestoga Town. If you look at the last letter from Conestoga Town, he's asking, Shihay's is asking John Penn for assistance through the winter because they were not allowed to have weapons and couldn't hunt to sustain themselves. They were completely dependent, right, on the locals there. And you see this, they both establish a environment that is impossible for us to be self-sufficient in, right? And that gives them 100% of the power in determining, what's really, quote, in our best interest or not. And at the same time, whenever there's something that's particularly inconvenient or difficult, we're left to fend for ourselves. With the Paxtons, we are left to fend to ourselves. When we look at, stats around education, around violence, around poverty, all of these things, it's like in those contexts, right, we're left to fend for ourselves. And I think that's a very universal truth, perhaps, of indigenous identity, not just in the United States but everywhere, where when you don't have that institutional power, you are at any given point in time whatever they need you to be. If they want you to be happy Christian Indians, to help support their agenda of sharing their religious beliefs, and I think particularly among Quaker faiths, this idea that their approach for peace and these different things is superior than that of other religions, right? When it's useful to paint Indians in that light, to show that fact or demonstrate that, then that's what you are. At the same time, you're a threat when they need your land, when they want your property, which we know was a huge issue for the Paxton Boys. In those contexts, then you're something different entirely. And in either case, you don't have the voice or the leverage or the space to actually state who you are, what you are, and what your interests are as a community, because the power is just so imbalanced. If you include the covenant chain, you have the two layers of local government there in the area, right? But we were also under the protection of the Haudenosaunee, the largest tribe, the largest conglomerate in the whole region, the oldest representative democracy in the entire world. It's a situation that you both question how it could have happened, and then also you're immediately aware the people at Conestoga Town knew, for some time, that they were at risk, both, even if not physically, definitely culturally, right? We see the migration out of Conestoga Town because they're well aware, right? This is not an area where we can survive and thrive as indigenous people, right? You see the leaving of the Mingo people. We have court records in North Carolina of a Susquehanna Indian attempting to enter the Catawba Nation. We see this massive diaspora, and I think it's absolutely heartbreaking, right, to realize that those people who remained made a conscious decision to remain, trusting and believing the people around them who said they would be safe there. And you see that when they took those survivors from the initial attack into the warehouse, right? You see in the list of goods that they brought with them, they included their treaty with the state of Maryland. That was in that list of goods that they took with them. They included their treaty with the state of Pennsylvania, or, well, with the Penn family. They included all of these things, and they clung to those things thinking that that would keep them safe. And you see this time and time again across all tribes in the region. You see, for example, the Powhatan tribes would often be given these silver badges that were, official permission of safety and granting of safety from the governors of those areas to be able to travel freely. And those people would still be murdered on the side of the road, right? We've seen cases of that happening. And, there's this really deep, I think, pain and sadness that remains in our communities of realizing how very broken that trust was, and the degree to which these people trusted that community to protect them according to those treaty commitments, the degree to which the lengths they went to thinking that they would be safe and protected, trusting and believing that those agreements would be maintained. And then to meet that kind of end, I think, is just, it's unimaginable in a modern context. And it's strange to have this visceral emotional connection to people that you've never met, but whose surviving community to this day remembers and feels that fear, that understanding that there is no commitment. Whenever you make those agreements, you can never rely on those commitments to be upheld, even to such extreme lengths where we're talking about the dismemberment of children, in the middle of a major city of the time, right? Like the level of violation is just unimaginable. And to come out of that and still see within 2 generations of that massacre there were already people coming back and asking for that land, I think that's what constitutes a tribe, right? To recover from something like that, something so devastating, and still be able to return to that legal process and trust that legal process again, and attempt to establish themselves as an independent community in the same space where their ancestors and kin were like absolutely massacred due to those rights being completely disrespected and ignored. And I think that's part of what makes me feel that strong connection and dedication to this work, because I realize the sacrifice and the wherewithal that it takes to return to that place within 2 generations and make that legal argument and try to say that we're still here, and to continually to be ignored, to have a joint resolution in the U.S. House of Representatives to recognize your tribe and to have it continually ignored. And not only did those measures not pass, the prevailing narrative has always been our extinction. And, to see something like that, those efforts be so ignored and disrespected over time, is something that I feel very strongly connected to. The efforts of these people who have come before me and other members of the tribe deserve to be seen and heard and talked about, because they are extraordinary efforts. I studied Native American studies in college. I have worked on basically every shred of information I could find on the survival of our people for the past 2 years. And in all of the tribes that I've looked at and things that I've learned about, I have never seen a tribe with this much legal documentation of seeking recognition through time and yet still be just like objectively called extinct without exception. I've not seen a single source aside from our own community ever actually acknowledge that, like, oh, well, there's clearly survivors because they're asking for their land back, they're asking for a reservation. That's something that I find very shocking. But I think the first thing you have to clarify in understanding the history of Susquehannock people is that in some ways it's quite distinct from the history of what I would describe as Conestoga Susquehannock people, because in my view of how I look about things, Conestoga Susquehannock people in many ways did not exist until 1701. Until you have the formation of that community at Conestoga Town, there's not really an understanding of what Conestoga Susquehannock people are, or what Conestoga Indians are, for that matter. And you can see that because if you try to find references to Conestoga Indians before 1700, you will find it very, very difficult. So the Susquehannocks start out as, they hold the purse strings to the whole region, to the Chesapeake Bay, right? So everybody from the Swedish to the Dutch to the English, everybody has an interest to make friends with them. And the English turned out to be more interested, I think, in the Powhatan tribes to the south, who were, mortal enemies. So, they kind of went a different direction here. But, you start in this position, and then you have several problems. The introduction of foreign trade into indigenous communities created a major problem because now all of a sudden you have conflict between tribes that is fueled by engaging with this external power, right? And because of that, this external power can come and go as they please. They get on their ships, they go where they're going to go. But for the natives in the area, that conflict remains. And when you have this endless encroachment, endless ships, more people coming in from outside, there's no longer the ability to hold your ground against these external enemies because you're also fighting on the home front. And for the Susquehannock people in particular, you see that becomes an issue because they try to ally themselves with the state of Maryland. They try to form this protective barrier. They're fine holding up against the Haudenosaunee. It's going to be great. And then we hear in historical records there's a smallpox outbreak at that settlement in the northern part of Maryland of Susquehannocks, right? There's a smallpox outbreak. They can't do it anymore. They don't have any more resources to defend from these raids, so they want to relocate further south into Maryland. The state of Maryland, the governor Calvert, decides that, actually, we would like you now to serve as a buffer on the Virginia side against some of these other tribes there, which are, maybe not as strong or as organized as the Haudenosaunee, so maybe you'll be all right over there. Our tribe says, no, we want to have, a safe place. We're going to move actually into the south of Maryland, where they built, that settlement. And from that point forward, we've established that there's a massive population decline, not just among the Susquehannocks, but on any particular tribe that has that degree of exposure to colonial contacts. We know that there's intertribal violence, which is also causing a loss of population. And that's in addition to just the general trials of life at that period of time, where it was not uncommon to die at 38 years old. So, you have this massive population decline. And then you also have this instability of being unable to find a place to rest and establish that cultural community. And because we're a Iroquoian people, right, with linguistic and cultural similarities to numerous tribes in the region, you also see a lot of shifting around. You see, newspaper articles and different sources, including some oral history, say that a majority of Susquehannocks, is what it says, a majority of Susquehannocks merged with the Meherrin, who still exist today. And the Meherrin people are also Iroquoian. So, you have this cultural loss, too, where, when you're able to kind of move about to all these different regions because you have kin there, it's very difficult to maintain a single, strong identity that can hold boundaries, that can hold treaties, that can push off raids, that can do this. That becomes very, very difficult. And I think in some ways it's an advantage for the Susquehannock people because, from the very beginning of our history, we're moving along that Susquehanna River. We're very kind of mobile and we're able to shift around when conditions are not favorable. And yet at the same time, being able to move in and out of other tribal communities creates major issues when you're trying to establish your identity as a single tribal body throughout history for the purpose of modern recognition, for example. We know from historical records and accounts of ceremonies, for example, that the Susquehannock religious practices were very similar to Lenape religious practices. We know from historical records that an unknown number of Susquehannocks merged with the Lenape at some point and did not join back with the Haudenosaunee up north. So this diaspora effect, I think, is what really caused the Susquehannock to go from being the purse strings of the whole region to kind of melding out and forming these different communities and going in different directions. And we see that in the establishment of Conestoga Town, because one thing that's I think a common misconception about Conestoga Town is that it consisted of Susquehannock Indians, which is true in part, but it also consisted of Shawnee Indians. There's also evidence to suggest that there were Lenape who were there. It was extremely unique in that it was a recognized intertribal community, and I think it's probably one of the earliest recognized intertribal communities that was a safe haven for people from several different tribes. And I think that's why there's kind of this distinction between Susquehannock history pre 1701 and post, because pre 1701 you have this extremely powerful, well organized tribe that consists of all these palisaded villages up and down the river that are somewhat mobile. Maybe they stay for 10 to 20 years and they move to another site, but they have this tributary system, they have this political structure. And then with colonization, all of that becomes disrupted. And all of those relationships with other tribes also become disruptive. And so you have this kind of chameleon people, the Susquehannock are, where they can kind of, oh, well, it's quite difficult, and some of us are going to stay and intermarry with the Meherrin. Some of us are going to actually go up north and rejoin the Haudenosaunee and stay there and intermarry among the Oneida or the Onondaga. Some of us are going to stay with the Lenape here in Pennsylvania. Some of us are actually going to migrate west to Ohio and then later become the Seneca Cayuga in Oklahoma. There's this very it's a tribe that I think has probably more far-reaching branches and divisions than probably any other tribe I can think of off the top of my head, just because the sheer number of cultural connections to these other Iroquoian-speaking peoples, it's hard to match. I think people in a modern context don't fully understand the utility of the Susquehanna River. And I think this is true of any river. The United States is tremendously blessed geographically, to the point that it's almost unbelievable the degree of geographical advantages we have over other countries due to our waterways. And, at a time, you have to remember that we didn't have trains, we didn't have planes or any other ways, and we also know that horses weren't being used pre-contact by Native American people. So the waterway is the only way to really travel and to have a tribe that can dominate a particular river, right? That can claim territory there, gives them tremendous movement capacity that I think it's hard to understand in a modern context just how important that was, and how much exchange of information and trade up and down a river can really impact a society and change how you form those kinship relationships with tribes that are maybe geographically distant but conveniently located along the river, where you speak a language that's vaguely familiar. I spoke to a linguistics person the other day about our language and then the revival efforts we're working on, and one of the things he'd pointed out is the Haudenosaunee languages, almost all of them, are mutually intelligible. Most of the time you can understand what someone's saying across the different dialects. I mean, at one point Conestoga language was described as a dialect of Oneida. And I think that linguistic similarity combined with those geographical points along the way, it's like you create a really deeply complicated society and a very active roadway of sorts. And you see how a lot of times, I think something that's very unique about this area in particular is, we see a very close area where you have people from Iroquoian language families, Algonquin language families, and just right all together, right up in there. And I think it creates a very unique situation where there has to be diplomacy there. There has to be a meeting place there. There has to be a crossroads there, because it's a pretty small geographical area relative to the number of not just tribes, but extremely distinct cultural tribes in that same little area there. And I think the the history of diplomacy in the area came long before Lancaster. Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying that the massacre itself is not my area of specialty, um, but the good news is we have a pretty clear picture of the state of Conestoga town leading up to the massacre. In part because the last letter from Chier's coming out of Conestoga town was dated just 2 weeks before the massacre. So we have a pretty close snapshot coming up there. And I think to see that last letter, which is actually on our tribal website, I can read it here if that's helpful for you. But you know, we know that John Penn is coming. They write him a letter, and they don't just write him a letter. They also include a string of wampum, which is extremely expensive, very high labor good, and shows a lot of it's the appropriate way to greet someone that you have deep respect for. And in the letter, they describe already, right, that, quote, some of our neighbors have encroached upon the tract of land reserved here for our use. We would now beg that our brother, the governor, to appoint our friend Thomas McKee, who lives near us, to take care of us and see justice done here. So, we know leading up to the massacre already, there's a sense of fear and understanding in that community that they might be in danger. They are aware that there are people encroaching on their land. And it had happened before. I believe it was people with similar political affiliations and views to the Paxton Boys who had actually previously tried to encroach on the land and were forcibly removed, I believe, by Logan. But at this point in time, we know that they're impoverished. They are unable to hunt. They are unable to have weapons. They are completely defenseless at this point. It's going on the winter, so they're asking for winter clothing even, and you have this picture of there's hope. There's this sense of we're greeting you the appropriate way. We're asking you to remember the commitments that you've made previously, and we're even offering a solution of someone specific, right, who Thomas McKee, who intermarried among the Shawnee people, and who spoke Conestoga language. He's a very famous trader. His descendants actually ended up in native communities in Canada, where they exist to this day. We had even a solution in mind for how we might protect ourselves further. I think that creates this sense of there's anxiety in the scene here. There's fear in the scene here, and there's also this hope that the commitments that were made will be taken seriously, and that their chosen person will be able to be appointed to protect them and take and make sure that the land is being respected, and the boundaries of that land are being respected, and that they'll be able to provide certain resources for the tribe in exchange for them not having weapons and being unable to provide these things for themselves. I think that was the understanding that they had, was in exchange for us staying on our land and not arming ourselves, they will provide us with the means to sustain our community through the winter. And that's the scene from Conestoga town, kind of leading right up into this massacre. Yes, in fact, use of that property in perpetuity. And one of the most interesting things about the massacre and subsequent declaration that the Conestoga people were extinct is, post massacre, there are two specific treaty efforts to remove any indigenous land claims to that land, which I always found very surprising, because either the Conestoga Indians are extinct or they're not. And if they're extinct, then you have no reason to pursue these further clarifications that, oh, and by the way, One of them, for example, specifically states that dependent tribes of the Haudenosaunee are also not entitled to that land. And by dependent tribes, that would include the Conestoga people, right? So there was clearly some awareness post massacre, right, that there were still people there. And I think, you know, these legal commitments and these legal documents, even prior to the massacre, there were concerns, and this is something our modern tribe has talked about extensively and continues to explore, which is the fact that these post-massacre land agreements and deeds and treaties to remove indigenous land claims from that area do not actually address the full Manor Township plot of 16,000 acres. They address the 500 acres that were left at the time of the massacre in 1763, which leaves, 15,500 acres unaccounted for. And I think that's part of what my interest is right now, is kind of exploring, what happened to those other 15,500 acres from 1701 to 1763? And where you see this trend among many, many tribes of just however much land you were given initially, you can guarantee that it will be progressively chipped away at until it's down to nothing or next to nothing. And I think that's something for Eastern tribes that's particularly true, because many Eastern tribes do not have a reservation. They do not have any land whatsoever, even if they're federally recognized, a lot of them. And that's a function of this process that has been going on for 400 years of treaty commitments of like, oh, well, we started you here and we slowly chipped away until we got you down to 500 acres, and then we settled all land claims for those 500 acres by signing treaties with the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee and the Cayuga in particular. And it's interesting because you're not actually acknowledging at any point the people that you actually signed that agreement with, and you're also not acknowledging, well, what happened to the rest of that land in the meantime. And that's something I think that really illustrates that point of, the law being applied in a way that supports the outcome that they already want to happen. And that's something you see throughout Indian country. There's a famous case. I believe it's, I'm trying to remember the name of the Supreme Court case. I think it's Lone Wolf versus something. But basically, this Supreme Court case establishes legally that Congress can change the terms of any treaty with any American Indian nation without consulting the tribe at all. Which then begs the question, well, then what is a treaty? Like, if you can change the terms at your discretion at any given point in time, then it's really not a treaty, is it? And I think that's how we have to understand or look at these early interactions, because it wasn't really any different then. The terms of these treaties were flexible, they were changeable, and whenever they were changeable, it was never to the benefit of the indigenous inhabitants. And you see that at Conestoga Town, too. Yeah, I think I consider myself to be deeply optimistic. I think it's important, and I think it's also a part of our culture, to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I think it has cost us tremendously historically, but I also think it's still the right thing to do. I think William Penn in particular had a grand vision for this colony of Pennsylvania, where the natives and the immigrants and the Jewish people and the religious minorities, and he had this idea for a safe haven of Quaker values, and I don't think that was insincere. And you can see that play out, where there are many areas in which the colony of Pennsylvania was the most progressive, more even than some modern countries today are on some specific issues. And I think it's important to acknowledge, especially for the time that it was, the grandness of that vision he had. And I think this is also optimistic for me in that it reminds us that we are not our ancestors and our descendants are not us. And you see that in the relationship between, William Penn and his descendants, who veered off the path pretty quickly. But in that same way, though, I'm hopeful and I'm reminded that in the same way that people can veer off the path of good intentions that was set by their ancestors, they can also veer back on. And I think that's what I see as an opportunity in the world today is, you know, you are not your ancestors and you have the opportunity, right, to rectify some of these mistakes in the same way that you have the opportunity to establish your own grand vision for the state of Pennsylvania and what the inclusion of genuine and authentic and documented Native American tribes into the modern state of Pennsylvania might look like. And when I think about William Penn, I think perhaps he was not the most informed about different aspects of Native culture. Perhaps he didn't do everything perfectly, as no one does. But I do genuinely believe that William Penn, in particular, had a vision in his mind for how Native people might survive and be supported in the state of Pennsylvania, even if on reservations, even if within these land boundaries, he saw them as part of the state of Pennsylvania. And it's deeply, deeply sad that today Native people are not part of the state of Pennsylvania. There is no significant Native community remaining in the state of Pennsylvania. There are no reservation lands remaining since the Corn Planter Tract. And I think that's the biggest historical failing of his vision, is the fact that regardless of how he imagined it and whether or not it was problematic the way he imagined natives being part of the state, he certainly had it in his mind that Native people would be part of the fabric of the state of Pennsylvania. And I think that's something that needs to be revisited in a modern context of, this state was founded with that in mind, and yet today the state of Pennsylvania is the only state in the region that does not have any land set aside for Native people, that does not recognize any tribes, that does not have any federally recognized tribes within its borders. And I think that there is a very strong argument to be made for the return of some to be made for the return of some degree of operation or land to the Lenape people, some degree of operation or land to the Shawnee people. And when I say that, I'm talking about the federally recognized tribes. I see an opportunity to realize that original vision in a modern context and imagine what it might be like to have Native neighbors as you're in the state of Pennsylvania, to have Native communities as your neighbors in the state of Pennsylvania. And I think that, there's just so much pushback and reluctance and complications about, who are the real natives and what are they entitled to and these different things. And I think that really detracts from that long run vision of how do we have this community in our state where people are interacting across these different cultural lines and boundaries in a respectful and safe and communal way. And, one of the things we're working on in the tribe right now is establishing a nonprofit division that we're going to call the Yohei Foundation. Yohei means tomorrow in our language. And one of the projects that I'm really excited about that we're hoping to get funding for is a homecoming project that will provide grants for down payments for tribal members and Native people to return to our historical homelands, because the state of Pennsylvania does not provide opportunities in and of itself for Native communities to exist there. And I think that's been the biggest failing of Penn's mission, even more than the historical atrocities in some ways, because those weren't necessarily directly connected to him, and those were things that happened not just in the state of Pennsylvania, but throughout the entire process of colonization. That those are the sins of the development of the United States of America that can't be rectified in that sense. But when we look at the modern state of Native American communities in the state of Pennsylvania. It's pitiful. There's no acceptance for, interest in, resources for the establishment of communities. And I'm not talking about grants to bring in, fly in a Delaware Indian from Oklahoma, fly in, an Oneida Indian from Wisconsin or New York. I'm talking about permanent established connections and communities that have been completely abandoned in the modern view of the state of Pennsylvania. And that is something that I think I would really like to see change. I wish I could say even that this was a purely historical issue. And there are many, many, many cases, massacres, individual murders of American Indian people in various parts of the colonies, all the way from top to bottom. And what's really interesting to me is that this continues on to this day in many contexts where, if you look, I'm not sure, how familiar you or your audience might be with the distinction between federal trust lands and crimes that occur on federal trust lands. But, the part of the reason why Native American women, for example, have, I believe, like a 3 or 4 times higher rate of murder, have unbelievably higher risks of sexual assault and these kinds of things. It's a continuation of this attitude towards Native people that their lives don't matter outside of the political implications, right, of them not being there anymore. You see this in, I know for the for this particular case, right? It was almost an immediate turnaround from the massacre. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who basically made a statement that basically the only people who are more savage than the Indians are these usurpers coming out of these regions of the UK where we look down on people who have this political or this religious belief or that religious belief or what have you. It's interesting that it becomes immediately politicized, and yet the actual consequence for these groups of people remains elusive. And that's something you see to this day, when we look at crimes that occur in American Indian communities and the difficulties or lack of access to any prosecution, because tribal governments cannot prosecute crimes committed on reservations by non-Indian people. And this creates massive issues to this day of this idea that there's a separate justice system when we're talking about crimes committed against Native people. And historically, right, there's bounties put out. You can see newspaper articles offering bounties for information or to bring to justice the people who killed the Conestoga Indians. And you can see that there's this vague idea that people wanted justice for that. Yet in practice, when they marched on the workhouse in Lancaster, in the middle of one of the most active emerging cities of the colonies, and were not prevented from murdering more people. You have this. It's like, okay, you're willing to offer these incentives to try to get justice, but it seems that you're far more interested in the political implications of what it means to no longer have Conestoga Indians here, and how you can make that the most useful for your own political agenda, your own interests, more than you're interested in actually understanding or getting justice for the things that have happened. And it's something that I think becomes very difficult in American Indian communities at large, because I think the relationship between indigenous people in the United States and colonial governments has always been a bit of an echo chamber. You keep hearing the same things come back in different formats, where at the end of the day, the message is pretty simple. The death of a Native American person, the harm of a Native American person, is not sufficiently concerning to the general government view that they're going to actually take action to do something about that in the wake of those issues. And it's very interesting, because if a tribe today, for example, were to try to commit tax fraud by withholding their casino earnings from their state compact, for example, the federal government would be on that very, very quickly. very, very quickly. If a tribe tried to operate a unsanctioned, so for example, tribes don't have to federally recognized tribes don't have to abide by state regulations. So, but they do have to abide by federal regulations. So when we talk about, tribes that want to get involved in, say, the marijuana industry, right? I guarantee you the federal government would be on that very, very quickly. But when we have, thousands of missing indigenous women, when we have crime rates on our reservations that are really, really high, when, the Blackfeet Reservation right now is dealing with cartel violence from Mexican cartels, these things, they suddenly have no issues. They have no concerns about intervening on our behalf in those scenarios. And I think that's something that becomes very frustrating. And you see it in Conestoga town through to the present, where if it's something that's to our benefit, right, there will be very strict regulations. There will be action taken if those regulations are violated. There will be intervention if at any point things go off the rails. If it's something to our detriment, then suddenly that's not so big of an issue. It's okay to allow that to occur. It's okay to allow crimes to occur in our communities, and then wonder why we have some of the systematic issues that we do. And there's something that's so fascinating to me about seeing how that's played out over time, and it's the same sort of message again and again and again, which is, if this is not politically useful for me to do something about, then I'm not going to do something about it. And furthermore, if I can gain something by leveraging this terrible thing that has happened to your people for my political gain, I will do so, even if I don't actually help in any way the actual victims of that crime. I wish I could say even that this was a purely historical issue. And there are many, many, many cases, massacres, individual murders of American Indian people in various parts of the colonies, all the way from, top to bottom. And, what's really interesting to me is that this continues on to this day in many contexts, where, if you look, I'm not sure, how familiar you or your audience might be with the distinction between federal trust lands and crimes that occur on federal trust lands. But, the part of the reason why Native American women, for example, have, I believe, like a 3 or 4 times higher rate of murder, have unbelievably higher risks of sexual assault and these kinds of things. It's a continuation of this attitude towards Native people that their lives don't matter outside of the political implications, right, of them not being there anymore. You see this I know for the for this particular case, right, it was almost an immediate turnaround from the massacre. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who basically made a statement that, basically the only people who are more savage than the Indians are, these usurpers coming out of, these regions of the UK where we look down on people who have this political or this religious belief or that religious belief or what have you. It's interesting that it becomes immediately politicized, and yet the actual consequence for these groups of people remains elusive. And that's something you see to this day, when we look at crimes that occur in American Indian communities and the difficulties or lack of access to any prosecution, because tribal governments cannot prosecute crimes committed on reservations by non-Indian people. And this creates massive issues to this day of this idea that there's a separate justice system when we're talking about crimes committed against Native people. And, historically, right, there's bounties put out. You can see newspaper articles, offering bounties for information or to bring to justice the people who killed the Conestoga Indians. And, you can see that there's this vague idea that people wanted justice for that. Yet in practice, when they marched on the workhouse in Lancaster, in the middle of one of the most active emerging cities of the colonies, and were not prevented from murdering more people. You have this. It's like, okay, you're willing to offer these incentives to try to get justice, but it seems that you're far more interested in the political implications of what it means to no longer have Conestoga Indians here, and how you can make that the most useful for your own political agenda, your own interests, more than you're interested in actually understanding or getting justice for the things that have happened. And it's something that I think becomes very difficult in American Indian communities at large, because I think the relationship between indigenous people in the United States and colonial governments has always been a bit of an echo chamber. You keep hearing the same things come back in different formats, where at the end of the day, the message is pretty simple. The death of a Native American person, the harm of a Native American person, is not sufficiently concerning to the general government view that they're going to actually take action to do something about that in the wake of those issues. And it's very interesting, because if a tribe today, for example, were to try to commit tax fraud by withholding their casino earnings from their state compact, for example, the federal government would be on that very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. If a tribe tried to operate a unsanctioned, so for example, tribes don't have to federally recognized tribes don't have to abide by state regulations. So, but they do have to abide by federal regulations. So when we talk about, tribes that want to get involved in, say, the marijuana industry, right? I guarantee you the federal government would be on that very, very quickly. But when we have, thousands of missing indigenous women, when we have crime rates on our reservations that are really, really high, when, the Blackfeet Reservation right now is dealing with cartel violence from Mexican cartels, these things, they suddenly have no issues. They have no concerns about intervening on our behalf in those scenarios. And I think that's something that becomes very frustrating. And you see it in Conestoga town through to the present, where if it's something that's to our benefit, right, there will be very strict regulations. There will be action taken if those regulations are violated. There will be intervention if at any point things go off the rails. If it's something to our detriment, then suddenly that's not so big of an issue. It's okay to allow that to occur. It's okay to allow crimes to occur in our communities, and then wonder why we have some of the systematic issues that we do. And there's something that's so fascinating to me about seeing how that's played out over time, and it's the same sort of message again and again and again, which is, if this is not politically useful for me to do something about, then I'm not going to do something about it. And furthermore, if I can gain something by leveraging this terrible thing that has happened to your people for my political gain, I will do so, even if I don't actually help in any way the actual victims of that crime. No, I think that's a very good point. And I think it scares people on some level to have to acknowledge that these things can happen, and they do happen. How many times do we see things come up in the news or in media today where, bystander syndrome takes over? And I think there's something deeply uncomfortable and a little scary about thinking like, oh, well, surely if I was in that situation, I would not have been a bystander. I think there's always something deeply uncomfortable about that realization that, like, oh, but you could be. People do. They stand by while genuinely horrendous things happen. And I think having to contend with that piece of human reality is also, we tend to avoid things that are uncomfortable, and that's pretty uncomfortable. To have to think to yourself, well, what would I have done? Would I have intervened? Would I have been able to intervene? And, there's cases where we know that there were people who would have. You see the Hershey family, who took in two Conestoga residents prior to the massacre, their story goes that the Paxton boys came to the Hershey property in search of those two survivors, and that they hid them, and that they, lived out the rest of their lives there. And John Penn actually wrote a letter, a proclamation to protect them, that they were not to be disturbed. And it's interesting because you always have to ask yourself this question of, where would I have been? Where would I have found myself in that scenario? And I think that gets into areas that people aren't always comfortable, kind of confronting or having that conversation about.
In our next and final episode of this series, Conestoga Town, I'm going to continue our conversation with Michael Mantooth of the Conestoga Susquehannock tribe. So join us then. Thanks for listening.